Thank you for joining us. I'm Gavin Kleespies, the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships for the Massachusetts Historical Society. And I'm glad to see a number of people in person, as well as all the people who are joining us online. This evening, we'll be talking about the history of the South End in Boston. This program is part of a series that we're doing where we're going to explore the different neighborhoods of Boston and how to research that history. So we have three presenters. I'm going to start out with just some very basic introductions about certain resources that are available online. We then have Jason Amos, the Executive Director of the Southj End Historical Society. And finally, we'll have Peter Drummey, who is the Chief Historian of the Massachusetts Historical Society, who will talk. Jason and Peter will both talk a little bit about resources that you can access at their respective institutions. For anyone who's joining MHS for the first time, I'd like to extend a special welcome. MHS is the first historical society in America. We date back to 1791. And as I sort of like to joke, when we were founded, our founder, Jeremy Belknap, wrote to Paul Revere, and Paul Revere wrote back. So we have been collecting history for the past 232 years. We've been publishing the history, and we've been making it available to the public through various means. And today, our library is open to anyone who wants to use it. You can come in and access our collection and do research here for free. And we're open 6 days a week. We do offer a host of programs. Our programs are made possible by the support of our members and donors. If you're not a member of MHS, I hope you'll consider supporting MHS and our efforts to make history available. Moving right along, I wanted to talk about just a couple of, if you're interested in researching the history of the South End and or where you are in the South End, there's a couple just great things that you can find online that can answer a ton of questions. One is the Atlas Scope project of the Leventhal Map Center at the Boston Public Library. So this is an online tool, and you can access about 25 different historical fire insurance atlases through this. If anyone is unclear on what a fire insurance atlas is, this is essentially a document printed for a municipality so that they can work out how much insurance they need to cover what the buildings are. But what they've done here is they've overlaid different atlases from different periods. So the sort of base area, the area outside the circle, is a current map of Boston. And what's inside the circle is, in this case, a map from 1938. And what fire insurance maps do is they tell you a whole bunch of information. And if you zoom in, which we're going to see if I remember how to zoom in here. I was doing this earlier today. Whoop. Where's my zoom button? I had a mouse when I was doing this earlier. Hold on a second. There we go. Okay. So a couple points about what you're seeing. The color of so what you're seeing is the footprint of a building. So you're seeing what this building would look like if you were in an airplane looking down at it. And so how it occupies its space. The color of the building indicates the material that is built out of. So the sort of reddish brown color represents brick. So it's different colors for different types of material. So you'll see usually like a yellowish color for wood. And this is telling you how the building is built. But it also tells you what's in the building or who owns the building. And so if you scooch in even closer, you can see that this building here on the corner was owned by Charles M. Fogey, and that's telling you who the owner is. So if you're interested in sort of understanding your neighborhood, like you can go down the street and you can look and you can say, like, are there a lot of Greek names? Are there a lot of Italian names? Are there a lot of African-American names? Who owned these buildings? And that's, I think, a great way to sort of learn more about the neighborhood. And this is available totally for free. And they have obviously tons of different maps. So if you want to go back a little further, you go back to the 1890s, and you see there's different names. But as you scroll out, you can see different densities. And if you go way back to like I think the 1860s might be too far back, but like the 1870s, you'll see like many more open lots. And so you can get a sense of how the neighborhood developed and when it developed. And you do occasionally come into these sort of weird black areas where one page of the atlas is bumpy, like it isn't syncing with the other page. But this is, available for free and it's great. The fire insurance atlases are also available in a variety of different locations, including some of them being here. But if you just sort of want to understand how a neighborhood develops, like a fire insurance map atlas is a great way to sort of understand, like, when is this neighborhood getting built up? Who's living here? Who's owning this? And what the building looks like and how dense it is. Another great resource, which I love, is city directories. So if you're unfamiliar with city directories, these are essentially, oops, I went too far, phone books from back in the day. And they come with lots and lots of advertisements, which are often actually really cool to look at. But we're going to scroll past the advertisements back to where I started from. You may be asking yourself, like, why is there a phone book in 1879? There were no phones in 1879. But these aren't really phone books; they're city directories. And so there we are. So it's the Boston Directory, embracing the city record, a general directory of citizens and business directory. And so these are back in the day how you found out who people were and where they lived and what they were doing. So I just zoomed into a different page here. Oops, no, I didn't. I meant to, but we'll just take a random page. But what these directories do, they don't give you phone numbers, obviously, but they tell you a lot about people. So if you look, Richard Lindsay was a printer, and his house was at 18 Cliff Street. So you can actually learn a whole bunch about people. So if you're looking for people, you can trace them from city directory to city directory, city directory. You can see when they move. You can see if their job changes. You can also, many city directories also have reverse address listings. So you can look and go down a street and say, like, Richard Lindsay, who was he living next to? Was he living next to somebody else named Lindsay? Was he living next to other people? Was he living next to people with similar ethnicity names, or was he an outlier? So this can be sort of a great way to sort of understand who people are and trace how they move throughout a city. And you can either do it by name, and not every city directory has a reverse index by address, but some of them do. And in those cases, you can actually see like lots of how people are interacting with each other. So both of these are things that are available online for free. So the Atlas Scope is available through the Leventhal Map Center at the Boston Public Library, and that's great. And city directories are just available through Google Books. So you can just find them on Google. And both of them run into copyright issues at a certain point. So they go into the first couple decades of the 20th century, and then they tend to peter out. So the city directories stop really being printed as city directories in like the 1940s. But they're also just not available because of copyright issues following that. And the Atlas Scope only goes to the 1930s. And then because of copyright, it's not available. So, but they're great resources if you just want to delve into any neighborhood history. So with that done, I am happy to turn it over to Jason, who's going to tell us about the South End.
All right. Well, thanks for having me tonight. As was mentioned, I'm Jason. I'm the executive director at the Southj End Historical Society. So obviously, much of the material that we have will relate specifically to the South End. So I won't necessarily get into specific collections. I'm just going to kind of talk about the formats and potential information available in the materials. So the Southj End Historical Society was founded in 1966 in response to the threat that urban renewal had on the neighborhood by a group of individuals who saw the value in the significant Victorian architecture. By 1973, they had raised this awareness to such a level that the neighborhood was placed on the National Register of Historic Places. And then 10 years later, the neighborhood became a landmark district here in the city. From the very beginning, our focus had sort of been on the architecture of the neighborhood. So that sort of influenced how our collections developed over time. And so our most heavily used items are probably our photograph and image collections. Our largest, and the one that we're probably most known for, is our 1972 South End Street Survey. As I mentioned, in 1973, it was declared a historic place. So in 1972, as part of that application, we had to photograph the neighborhood. And so those photos make up this collection. In total, there's more than 3,000 photos that show both the individual buildings, such as the one on the left there, as well as entire streetscapes. And for those who aren't familiar, that is actually our office right there at 532 Mass Ave. And the street view is our side of Mass Ave. Over the years, it has been said that we've photographed every street in the neighborhood, but there are some streets such as Taylor and Haven that we don't have photos for, and that I have not found any documentation that we have photographed them. So while it has more than 3,000 photos in it, it's not exactly every photo that we would consider in the South End. So our next largest collection and most frequently used is the Richard Card collection. Dick was a founding member of the Historical Society and served as the president for a number of years. Throughout his life, he collected copies of images of the South End from pretty much every institution here in the city. So you can think the BPL, the Athenaeum, the Bostonian Society, Historic New England. He even found copies of photos from the South End at the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, New York. Many of the photos focus on the Victorian period in the South End, and as such, they are of more of the landmark buildings, the distinguishable features in the South End, like churches, parks, hotels, those sorts of structures, as opposed to the individual houses in the South End. The good thing with this collection is Dick went through and wrote captions for all of the photos, explaining the significance of them and any changes over the years to the use of the buildings. He also included photos from his time in the South End, such as numerous church fires, such as the one on the screen. And it's very useful for just general photos of the South End. We also have a cast iron survey that was done in 1996 for those who are interested in what pattern of cast iron there may be on their house. In total, the two consultants that we hired surveyed 1,700 properties and took more than 600 photos. So you may be thinking, why is there only 600 photos if they looked at 1,700 properties? For those who have walked down the South End, you may know that many streets and entire blocks are all built the same way. So they also had very similar patterns of cast iron. And so this was 1996, and photography was done with film. So rather than waste the film, I believe they took a sample photo of the pattern that was on those blocks, and then annotated the little survey sheets to say houses 39 through 47, for example, all have the same pattern. So we may have information in this collection regarding the pattern that was on your house, but we may not have a photo of your house. We also have a small postcard collection. And as I mentioned, the card collection focuses on the Victorian period, and the 72 survey is obviously the 1970s. The postcard collection sort of fills in the gap between the Victorian photos and the 72 photos. So many of these are from the 19-teens, 20s, and 30s. And like the card collection, it also focuses heavily on the churches, parks, hotels, and other sort of civic buildings in the neighborhood. In addition to the photo collections, we also have a small library of books. So in total, we have about 341 titles, last time I counted, that include various topics on South End history, Boston history, Victoriana, architecture, and antiques, so that sort of material. We are not a lending library, so if you want to use material from the collection, you would need to make an appointment and come visit us. We do, however, make a list of all of the books available online. So if you anticipate needing a book for a longer period of time, you can use that list to then search, say, the BPL catalog, or maybe at the Athenaeum, and then maybe even find a copy digitized to help you do your research in the South End. And the backbone of our collection is our documents collections. These are the records that we've been in: records, items, maps, pamphlets, brochures, newsletters for organizations in the neighborhood, and other sorts of documents that were deemed to have some sort of enduring value in terms of documenting the South End's history. This includes stuff on buildings, Boston history. We're very heavily focused on material relating from urban renewal. We have a large collection of maps relating to the BRA and other sorts of organizations involved with urban renewal. We also have material relating to neighborhood associations. There's a couple. We have the papers for Chester Square Neighborhood Association, as well as some stuff relating to Blackstone Square, Franklin Neighborhood Association, Ellis, the 8 Streets. We pretty much have a little bit of stuff from all the neighborhood associations. We are a collecting institution, so if you do live in the South End or have material relating to the South End, we are open to taking that material as a donation. South End history did not end with the Victorian period. It did not end in the 70s when we photographed the material. So if you've been a resident in the neighborhood for an extended period of time, or even briefly, we are open to collecting any material relating to any period in the South End. That includes maybe neighborhood group organizations or events that happened 5, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. We are interested in documenting that part of the neighborhood's history as well. So now that I've told you a little bit about our various formats, this is how you would access the material in our collection. So from our homepage, there are 2 methods of doing it. One, we have a rotating image that you can click on when it's on the collections image, as well as on the top part where it says research, which will bring down a drop-down menu with collections. As you can see, the South End Street Survey sort of has its own landing page because it is that frequently used. We don't have make a note about that. We don't have all of those photos digitized. Well, sorry, they are digitized, but they are not available online yet. Part of my project is getting them all online as my time allows. So when you reach the collections page, it takes you to this landing page. This will be where all of our processed materials that are available for research are available. And this is also where you will see the collection or library book list on the top there. This will be a brief description of the material as well as the title of the materials. And so when you click on the titles, it will bring you to the finding aid for that material. They're all PDFs, so you can print them out if you'd like. Some of them are rather large. And besides some of the routine material that you would find in an organization's finding aids, there are 4 sections of the finding aid that are probably most important to a researcher. That is the scope and content note, which will sort of be the description of the material in the collection. We add historical notes. So that will be information on the person or group or corporation that donated the material to us. We also include an organization section, which will help you navigate the finding aid as it provides a little bit more information on each of the series and subseries in the collection. And then lastly, there is going to be the item folder list, which is really the meat of the finding aid that goes into describing the folders and items in more detail. There is one collection that I wanted to point out because it sort of forms the backbone of everything that we have, and that's the Legacy Archival Materials collection. It is sort of an artificial collection of everything that we have collected since 1966. So in 2010, the executive directors cataloged all of the material that we have and put it into an internal database for the director's use, which doesn't make it very useful to patrons who would just want to browse our materials. So what I've done is I exported all of those records into a finding aid and posted that to the website for people to look at. It is my hope that eventually this finding aid disappears. Now, you may wonder why I'd want a finding aid to sort of disappear, but that is because the material that is described in this collection is sort of at a high level where the information is not really relevant to, or not really understandable to what's in the folders. So with the assistance of interns and as my time permits, we've been going through the collection and pulling out all of the subjects that were identified in the materials. At the time, I believe the director found 40 different subjects. So as I go back to here, the collection on public housing and the collection on churches were actually parts of that legacy collection. But now if you click on the finding aids, it's going to be described more at the item level so that you will see what the titles of the newspapers are, what the news articles are, what the newsletters, and what the individual documents are, as opposed to something that just says articles relating to the creation of the Boston Center for the Arts. So that is why is my hope that that collection eventually, that finding aid rather, sort of disappears. And so if you are, after going through all of our finding aids, not finding any information relevant to your question, you can always email us. There are collections that are not processed. And as I said, we are a collecting institution. So documents and other stuff will be coming in or do come in. So what we hold is quite changeable. I do just want to mention that, as you may have recognized, we are very heavily focused on the architecture in the South End, as opposed to, say, other historical societies that also have genealogical and family papers. In fact, the only one that we really have of any sort of family papers are the Everett family letters from 1861 to 1859. Other than that, everything tends to be more on the architecture and the neighborhood as it is built. So that's what the Historical Society has. And as I said, the easiest way to get a hold of me is to email me. Oftentimes, if you're just looking for a photo, it's a simple, quick email for me to send you a copy of what we have or let you know what's in the collection. So thank you.
I'm Peter Drummey, and I'm a librarian and historian here at the Massachusetts Historical Society. And one thing I should apologize for doing in advance, and that is I usually, for short, say the Historical Society. And of course, having Jason and others of you here from the South End Historical Society, this is a blunder in advance of blundering. But I would point out that when we were founded in 1791, right after the Revolution, our name was simply the Historical Society. There were no others. Now, we were incorporated soon thereafter. So we've been the Massachusetts Historical Society for a very long time, but I just use that name as shorthand. What I propose doing is not telling you, essentially reiterating many of the things you just heard, but tell you about what we hold that supports the research that you can do through the South End Historical Society. And then, in just a couple of minutes, present some of the other sources that are available to you here in Boston for studying the history of the South End. I've also brought out just a few examples of things from our collections that are reinforcing some of the things you just heard about from Gavin and Jason, but also to give you a sense of the kind of things you'll find here. The Massachusetts Historical Society is primarily a manuscript repository. We collect personal and family papers, letters and diaries, and manuscript documents, thousands of collections containing millions of pages of documents that essentially document the entire course of American history since European settlement. And it's, at least for the colonial and early national period, not restricted to focus on Massachusetts. It was, at the time of its founding, the Massachusetts Historical Society was attempting to collect the national history. This is people who came together here in Boston in the 1790s, primarily concerned that the history of the Revolution would be lost as that generation died away. The people, that's why the Reverend Jeremy Belknap, as Gavin said, wrote to Paul Revere and said, what did happen back in 1775? It's not our first document because this letter was written in 1798, but it was the sensibility of what they were trying to collect. And we continue to collect up to the present, and collecting personal papers, papers of individuals or families. There's a hiatus that takes place. There's usually, except if you're in public life, there's a zone of privacy around your life and life of your immediate ancestors. So no one is very happy with the idea of someone coming here and reading their mother and father writing to each other. So we'll often have papers that we've collected to come up to the near past, but sometimes they're closed for some specific period of years. And more often they come to us after the generation has died away. It's also a case that often with those sort of changes in family life, the passing of a generation, that people think these papers are more important and more interesting than just to family members, and they'll come to us. We live in such a mobile society that often those papers are coming back here from elsewhere rather than necessarily just down the street. We don't attempt to cover the same ground that the Southj End Historical Society does, although having this long existence before the Southj End Historical Society came into being, we have collected things in lieu of an institution in the neighborhood. The local branches of the Boston Public Library, in almost every case, are extremely strong for local history, the history of that area. I understand that right now that's a circumstance that's not particularly convenient, but it is the case that that's often a very good source for local history information. It's also the case that we don't attempt to do everything here. We focus on collecting personal papers, manuscripts. We have enormous collections of books and pamphlets, photographs and maps, newspapers, all this research material, hundreds of paintings, but that's all here to support research on these manuscript collections. As Jason alluded to, there's an enormous genealogical research library just a few blocks away, the New England Historic Genealogical Society over on Newbury Street. And most other states, what we do and what the Genealogical Society does would be two departments within the same institution. Here, we were founded in the 18th century. They were founded in 1845. That we have gone in different directions. We cooperate. We overlap in terms of what we've collected. We're good neighbors to each other. I worked briefly a very long time ago as the curator of manuscripts there, so I'm very familiar with what they do and what they have. So if you're interested in a family, your own family or a family that lived in the Southj End, it's a very valuable library. They've probably gone further in putting their collections online than any large research library I know, because they're a national, international organization, very strong for New England, but really covering the entire United States. So that's much more easily done. It's still a wonderful place to visit and wonderful materials held there. But I think what I would emphasize to you, suspecting what you're interested in genealogical research, family history, a vital part of that is local historical information. So they've built up an immense collection of published local historical information, books and pamphlets on places, communities, towns, cities, states, regions of the United States, especially Canada and Atlantic Canada, where there's strong genealogical connections, and elsewhere in the world as well. But it's a library, even if you're not interested in the descent of a specific family, it can be very valuable for studying local history. In a minute, I'll get to a bibliography of local history here in New England. And one of the things is, when this bibliography was first produced, they would put the symbol, each library in the United States has a symbol, which is always the state, the city, and then some sort of alphabetical marker to indicate to keep track with a brief letter form the individual library. So we are MHI, Massachusetts Historical Society. They're MBNEH, Massachusetts, Boston, New England Historical Society. They don't get into that's too long an acronym. But if you're looking through these bibliographies, the acronym you'll see most often, other than for the town or community itself, will be that of the Genealogical Society. They have, I think, probably the strongest local historical society altogether, and certainly in many instances as strong as a community or a town will have itself for local history. So that's an important institution. The Boston Public Library, through its branches, is strong for local history in all of the different neighborhoods of Boston. It has an enormous number of branch libraries, in addition to essentially just down the street, down Boylston Street, running what is essentially the equivalent of a major university research library as a department of city government. So there are many things. People become impatient with the Boston Public Library about services or availability, things like that. But what they're doing there is really extraordinary in terms of the service display. I would point out, because I'm interested in the history of everything, there was a time when the Boston Public Library used to be open about 80 hours a week. You could go there at 10 o'clock on Sunday evening to read or do research. The reason for that was that there was essentially a center for public education. This is a long time in the rearview mirror now, but it's still, this commitment to public service is very strong there. So those are just the indication of, an addition to having this very strong local historical society and its materials available to you, you have sort of backing that up. You have, these wonderful resources conveniently at hand. I'm just going to point out a few things that we have that support more directly research in the South End. And that is, while we collect personal and family papers, so it's not unlikely that if a family is long resident in the South End, will have materials about them, where they came from, where they went to, and their life there. But we also collect institutional records in lieu of family and personal records. And we have important collections of church records. And Massachusetts, because vital record information is contained within church records, essentially extinct churches that no longer exist, their records theoretically are the property of the state because they contain this vital record information. And hierarchical churches, there's usually a denominational archive that they go to. For Episcopalians, I think it's in Dallas, Texas, which isn't the most convenient place, but there is a strong holding of Episcopal church records here in Boston as well. But at the same time, the state has rarely, if ever, made an effort to accumulate these records. So often, church records, a lot of wooden churches in the neighborhood of Boston to this day. So if one has a terrible fire, we can almost depend on being contacted by other churches that are looking for a safe place to store their records. So if we've acquired on deposit, the use is the same here, deposited materials and materials that are our property, but nevertheless, churches will put their records here to make them safe. That's across the city, more or less. There are denominations which are more heavily represented in specific archives. And for Unitarian churches, the Harvard Divinity School has very strong collections, and we do too, because liberal ministers played an important role in the founding and the early history of the Historical Society. The Congregational Library on Beacon Street has wonderful access to Trinitarian congregational churches, more conservative churches over time, and built up a big collection there. So this is not simply the history of religion. This is where vital record information resides: baptisms, births, marriages, deaths, funerals recorded in church records can be very valuable. The state accumulated information from these records through 1850 and systematically published it. But that's a kind of hard break. Through the Genealogical Society, you can see more modern records for many denominations through their website. American Ancestor. It's kind of easier to remember perhaps than their name. So these are all things that are available to you. The good news is there's an immense amount of historical information available for doing research on broad topics and specifically in the history of the South End. The bad news is it's all spread all over the place and not in a particularly logical way. For instance, I brought out a little collection, which is kind of works progress administration, the WPA project. Someone retained a draft that they had written, which was sort of a social history of the South End. I suspect this is more interesting for when this was written in the 1940s than for the historical information in it by a woman named Sarah Penanti, but a kind of remarkable document because it's very careful and scholarly for its time. The narrative is relatively brief, but it's supported by a very large amount of bibliographic information about the sources for it. But her argument was that essentially the South End isn't this progress from one place to another, but in fact there have been these sort of times over the history since its development where it's changed character in a relatively rapid and substantial way. But I noted when I was looking at this today that it came to us in 1966. Frankly, it's very hard for me to believe that it wouldn't be safely in your hands if it hadn't come at that time. It's not long. It would be easy to make a copy of it. But nevertheless, that's another thing. We have materials there, and we're a private nonprofit organization, an independent research library, but we have early materials that in any other circumstance would be considered, I think, fairly to be state records. But the state was simply not collecting and preserving records. In the world, the Massachusetts State Archives is kind of a new organization in terms of its development. Until not very long ago, 35 years, it was in the basement of the State House, with all that implies about how it was cared for. So these are I'm just going to mention a few things I have up here. So if you want to take a look at them after, but I do want to make time so we can make up an answer for any question you have for us this evening. But I've just brought out an example, not of a fire insurance atlas, but in addition to these fire insurance atlases that Gavin's absolutely correct, that is part of the online viewer that the Leventhal Map Center had. There's an Atlas of Suffolk County that dates from the 1880s, but the maps in it are from the 1870s. And this is somewhat in the same theme as it shows properties and ownership of them. It's in the same sort of sensibility as the fire insurance atlases, but it's going back very far to have detailed building by building inventory of a neighborhood. This is the Samuel Hopkins Atlas of Suffolk County. And just as an example of what these look like. And be careful because it's very brittle, but turn the pages if I'm not showing the part at the South End that's of particular interest to you. And then next to it, this is bibliography This is the bibliography of Massachusetts that came out by the Committee for a New England Bibliography, an organization started in the 1970s at Boston University, later moved here as its base to the Massachusetts Historical Society. This is such an old bibliography. It's kind of should be in a bibliography itself, but there are 5,000 entries under Boston. Their South End entries aren't picked out separately, but it's very well indexed. But this is a bibliographer who went and looked at each item in this. So it's wonderfully important for looking for an earlier generation of scholarship. It was narrowly focused. So after it was produced, they brought out a supplement, and the supplement has more than 1,000 additional entries about Massachusetts, but they're not 1,000 more books and articles about Boston were printed in the next 10 years. What it is they expanded what they included into it and started citing government documents and especially dissertations. And in the Boston metropolitan area, many places that have a School of Design or urban planning or even political science department have used neighborhood studies of the history of Boston itself. So there are a lot of examples of the South End being used as sort of more or less a case study. And just two more things, and that's Sarah Panetti's wonderful essay on this is very tattered, but she gave it to the Historical Society in the 1960s. This is work that I think she had done maybe more than 20 years, certainly more than 20 years before, maybe 30 years before. What's sort of interesting about it is because of the Second World War, all of these works progress administration projects sort of folded up quickly during the war. So people were left holding these incomplete projects and notes. And last, and I won't move it over, we have an accidental publication about the development of the South End. It's a catalog of the furniture, this furniture that Isaac Vos, famous furniture maker here in Boston, is associated with in the first decades of the 19th century. And it's very interesting in that respect. Robert Mussey, a furniture restorer, and Clark Pierce wrote this together, and then they put on a substantial show of this furniture here. I don't care for the furniture, but it's an awfully interesting story. But what happened in the course of documenting this, they fell in love with the very early history of the South End, because as the neck of Boston expanded in those first decades of the 20th century, business entrepreneurs, including relatively large number of furniture makers, not beginning, but Isaac Vos very early in that story, moving in to the new South End as the land was filled and it developed. And it's kind of a wonderful social history of that period of the history of the South End, the very first generation of people living on this made land along the Old Neck. And we actually have many copies of this book. So if you're interested in that, either furniture or South End story, see Gavin after this meeting. I don't want to go on too long. I probably have gone on too long, but I don't want to take up all your time, because I think it'd be really useful to hear if you have any specific questions for us. So I'm going to invite Jason to come back and be here, and we'll, if it's necessary, we'll take turns answering from the podium, but see if there are things you know about, that want to share with other people here. Gavin has a microphone, so if people are hearing this online, so if you have a question or a comment, just wait till he comes around with the microphone. And I think we'll also probably, at least briefly, if there is a question, briefly repeat what it is, so people listening in online can make sure that they know what our answers are in reference to.
So I would also say that our book on Vose and the South End came out a couple of years ago, and we have a number of copies of it. So it is highly discounted and for sale this evening, cheaper than you could get it online. If anyone has any questions, please raise their hand.
Jason, thanks so much for telling us about the South End Historical Society. I wondered, because local history can be so epic, is there a particular angle or story in history that you've encountered that you wish people would research more?
The story of the South End is pretty well known, of the rise of the South End, if you will, with the expansion of the neck and people moving in, and then the downfall of the South End when the Back Bay was built. It's not to say it is a downfall, because it is a very vibrant and wonderful neighborhood with great people in it. So that's a tough question in terms of the South End, because it has been sort of documented and the story is kind of known. But I would say I wish that there was more research and documentation done on sort of the immigrants that moved in when the neighborhood, and after say the 1900s, and what happened with them, because there was a lot of change of different groups coming in and then moving out. And urban renewal in the South End is very well documented in terms of what the city did to the residents, which is very unfortunate, because many of them were there for a very long time. So that part of the South End's history has kind of moved away from the city with their displacement. So I wish that there would have been more documentation done as to what their experiences were like. We are doing an oral history project that sort of documents the renewal of the South End, if you will, in the 70s and 80s, and the change that happened then. But just the stuff kind of before that and, after the Victorian period is something I wish that was very heavily researched and written about. So.
I'm going to, before we answer your question, either now or later, Gavin, can you talk about the Little Syria exhibition? We had a temporary exhibition about this very interesting neighborhood that largely is gone now, where people from Lebanon and Syria moved to and lived for essentially a couple of generations. Now many live in West Roxbury, kind of reproduce their community downtown as things were renovated out of existence. But a kind of remarkable project where people are trying to do for that specific neighborhood and population exactly what Jason's talking about. And I wanted to point out that personal papers sometimes can be useful for studying institutions and vice versa, so that we have a very large collection of the papers of James Freeman Clarke, who is the minister at the Church of Disciples. And essentially, this is a church that was a liberal Unitarian church in the South End, essentially during his lifetime. And then with his passing, the building remains, as many church buildings do, but has been repurposed. And on the other end of the scale, the South Congregation, the Edward Hale Church, as it's sometimes called, that church, the congregation left and moved into the fashionable Back Bay at the end of the 19th century. But that church has, following this immigrant story, has had a temple and then has been for a long time a Greek Orthodox church along Union Park. And that's where the building retains, but it's gone through these different iterations, kind of recapitulating the story of the immigrant experience. But you had a question?
Yeah, actually emailed you, Jason, about this same topic. So I think I know your answer, but I'm doing some research on settlement houses in the South End. So I'm just curious, Peter, under the kind of institutional records that you have here, off the top of your head, do you know if you have anything on settlement houses? I don't know if this is
well, the South End House is probably
right
first and most famous and has wonderful description of it and its activities. What happens is South End House becomes so well-known and famous, it kind of shadows everything else. And it's also where I was frustrated in trying to think of something that I could show you other than what you know through Robert Wood's works on South End House. And it turns out that it looms so large that people would simply index where its name appeared in the letterhead of a letter that might be entirely different. In fact, we have some correspondence with the South End House Caddy Camp at Poland Springs in Maine, which I really would like to know more about were they sort of supplying sort of immigrant children to be caddies to know what get resource. I mean, it's just anomalous, but that, as I say, that it has been, I think, wonderfully well documented to the kind of with less interest to, it's like Chickering pianos. There are many piano factories, but there is one that people tend to know a lot about. And I think that one thing to look at, the South Congregational records won't work because the part that has to do with charities is later in their life, when they're in the Back Bay. But the thing to remember is a lot of this work we would associate with settlement houses was done essentially as church services. And that's not simply church services to your own congregants, but simply filling a social need. In fact, it's interesting how important churches were in the structure of a whole range of charitable giving. Edward Everett Hale, from the South Congregation, he kind of started a kind of charitable Ponzi scheme, Lend a Hand Society, which records are here, which was essentially, instead of giving money to a good cause, convince, I forget what the number was, 7 or 10, convince 10 other people to give it. But instead of them giving money, they had to convince 10 people in turn. And before you know it, everybody in the world would be giving money to good causes. And it really had a very powerful effect. It was mostly charity directed elsewhere, to the American South after the Civil War and Appalachia, but it is a remarkable story. And there was essentially the equivalent of United Charities here in Boston with charity directories, so you could locate who was doing specific work on. We have some of those in our reference set because they're just very handy to figure out who feels they're responsible for some specific good work.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up, and this is
Sure.
sort of extending beyond the South End, if that's okay. But, you know, like with family papers, like Agassiz Shaw, I think was the name of the woman who started the Elizabeth Peabody House in the West End. Is it worthwhile to kind of look at those family papers?
Oh yes, it's not in every case, but like James Freeman Clark is a really good example of that. I mean, these are his personal papers, but and also his papers as lifelong papers as a minister. But there's an enormous amount about philanthropy and charitable work within his papers. It's essentially his personal papers, and congregational churches, you're an employee of the congregation, the minister employee of the congregation. So when you move, you take your records along with you. Clark is kind of an anomaly because the church was sort of built around him. The Church of the Disciples focused on him and his importance, so that where the church records end and his personal papers begin is very gray.
I just want to add something to Peter's comment about South End houses sending kids to Maine. One of my friend's father actually was sent to Maine by the South End house to do camp work. So it was not uncommon for them to do that. He was sent there for a summer, I believe, to do some work. So
we have a question online that's asking, do you have records from any tenants groups from the 1960s and 70s, such as the Community Assembly for United South End, South End Project Area Committee, a few more?
we do have some that sort of, I've seen the South End Project Action Committee on file cabinets in the basement or in our storage space. That material isn't processed or cataloged, but we do have records relating to those types of organizations. So if someone's looking for something specific, just feel free to send an email and I will take a look and let you know what we have if we have anything.
I would also say that actually it's really worth looking at the Northeastern University archives. They did a really great job of amassing stuff from small grassroots organizations across the city. So that's a good place to check.
I've lived in the South End since 1964, and I've written 4 books of history. It's more social history for the most part, except for one book, Once Upon a Neighborhood, which is a timeline of South End history from the beginning. And I call it a timeline of South End history and anecdotal history because I add some little stories in there. How I do my research is different from everybody else, I guess. I've been collecting things for many years, and I have probably more than 70 3-ring notebooks full of stuff. And when I have a question about history, which I always do, I look first in those notebooks and in my computer files. And then if I don't find it, I'm a member of the Boston Athenaeum, and I go there and I am an addict of the city directories. In fact, they give me a hard time in there. They tease me. They say, Allison, we're getting rid of those city directories. But those are my life, as well as many other things there.
Paul Wright, I'm on the board of the Southj End Historical Society, and I'm inviting Allison to donate her notebooks to us. Yes, we do.
Allison, I'll make room for your stuff. Yeah. Trust me. I've been making room for more stuff.
I just wanted to get back to the settlement houses and mention that there's an enormous collection at Houghton Library of Robert Wood's papers and the South End Settlement House papers. Half of that collection, however, is at the University of Minnesota in the Social Welfare Archives. I've been in both collections and I can see where the seams are, and I've been urging one or the other of them to give it up and put it all together. So it's for that period from the late Victorian into the 50s, the South End Settlement House history is essential, I think.
Thank you all for coming. And thank you to the people who are joining us online. And thank you to Jason and to Peter for this presentation. And I'm sure both Jason and Peter would be happy to answer questions. And as I mentioned, we have lots of copies of the Vose book at a highly discounted price if anyone's interested. Thank you.